QRM Office 22, Rio de Janeiro City, Federative Unit, Rio de Janeiro, National State, Brazil. We will kind of have a movement, quite simple, quite clear. As you can observe, we are playing video game, and not in my pajamas, you know. But we will have a conversation, simple, easy, and planned. It's not planned, but we'll go like this. We will check that we are trying to have a financial service by my citizenship under aggression. You take a look at the blog Risk Report 2022, 3 February.blogspot.com. The last post on top will kind of have some arguments by law, considering the organization of state by governments and democratic institutions with specific chairs. The ministries on it, the president since 1988 equally on it. In the second line reported, we have the paramilitary organization and the drug cartel associated at fails on institutions. And the last thing is we have crimes observed, which is the silence, the fake data and fake records. If it goes in a subsidiary area like criminal, it implies all systematical failure until that point. And for sure, an investor will have a cognitive bias, or the partnership inside the security forum will be in the same way as the cognitive bias, at least as a risk by hoax made with crooks have the continued by protection on institutions. And then we will check that my citizenship goes by law and constitution, and all proofs collected as evidence indeed are legal. You can use all. And the abusive procedures, for sure, it's not a right because it's abusive. And we'll check that the USSR, Russia, has hood next as Europe, but Russia is kind of the Eurasia, and Ukraine is kind of with a piece of separatist movement and the association with the Europe, but has maybe at the past association with the Russia. The Russia is saying that these separatist areas kind of are recognized, but recognized as which purpose? The first one, a capital letter, or a small letter, or a capital letter with a small letter as integration, forming a thing as itself. Let's consider that we have the situation in the very first moment as Ukraine, a capital letter, a small letter, and their own interest at this moment as a capital letter. If they sustain the A capital letter, they are not linked anymore with the Ukraine, and they have no association with the USSR. It implies they had self-determination. If the USSR is a small letter and Ukraine is a capital letter, and they present themselves as a capital letter or a small letter, indeed they had no sovereignty because they didn't have the self-determination by an association with an area as influence. It implies that if the Russia had this kind of movement before, all areas as separatist movement with association with any other purpose indeed has no self-determination and can't have a sovereignty. It implies by the logical here, quite simple, at this sheet of paper, at our diary, because I have problems at communication serves as part of violation and aggressions against my basic rights and guarantees that all separatist movement associated with a purpose before can't be considered self-determination, but a determination of intention or motivation that goes before preparing this kind of separatist movement. In the same way, we will check now that, for instance, let's consider that these two areas indeed had a self-determination. It implies that they are not linked with the Russia, they are not linked with the Ukraine, nor the Europe in the same way. They are kind of themselves. Let's consider that they are a unique thing. It means that they kind of can now be offering or get in touch with Russia and get in touch with the Ukraine as different things, interface things between two both. Now let's consider that they kind of are not the same thing, they are different things. They can be combined with two both as different things and will have, and they indeed must have, the same report and statement about these two things. If they do not have the same statement about the same facts and circumstances at these two things, areas as Ukraine and Russia, indeed we must have on mind if we had a cognitive bias and if this goes since from the very beginning, which implies the self-determination with a hidden level. Sounds complex, but indeed is too simple. The idea is kind of have something like this. The first thing that we will have on mind is kind of, let's suppose that this area here is the Russia. This area here is the Ukraine. In a very specific moment, we had a disruptive event on two areas, like Ukraine and Russia, set, a kind of zone as intersection. And the intersection can be made as something according with the interest as Russia or against the interest of Ukraine and by complementarity, taking advantage of two both. And if this goes as self-determination, indeed may be the conqueror, the right as freedom. But if this not goes like this, kind of having the intersection, I will put Russia as A and Ukraine as B, as something like this, as it means that we have prevalence of one interest and maybe they have no self-determination. And if goes as something like this, in the same way, the only way to they have the self-determination is have this area here, and as the complementary has complement that relation, we will have this situation here, which is this thing here. They are a unique thing or they are divided. If they are divided, we kind of must have this self-determination in the same way. But consider that they are at the same event, it will be something very difficult to have this kind of self-determination, except if they accept an agreement and abandon this movement. But there will be kind of no separatist movement anymore. It implies that we have an interest maybe before. Don't you agree? Quantifying reality by measure using a 12 years old model as Venn diagram, a bit of geopolitics and my crude diary in an area that do not respect my civil rights and guarantees. The financial service euro is made 1988 up to 2028. The prison of international criminals is a guarantee as and very equal to the guarantees of the investor. Have the research of the environment since do not commit an abuse. Have a nice night.